Welcome to the Heretic's Guide to Gemstone, my historical exploration series for the massively multiplayer text-based game, GemStone III. I'm your host, the player of Xorus. This is the second episode of my series exploring the Broken Lands, its history and hidden meaning. In this episode, I will focus on the Ice Age context of the Broken Lands and its backstory, the relationship to the archaic world setting, which was called Shadow World, as well as the things that only existed or were only true in Gemstone. That is, the surrounding game in that period, like you would do in archaeology, contemporary time horizons. In the first episode, I showed you Kygar's statement of authorial intent for the Broken Lands. The theme for the whole thing was exploring an ill-defined point in Shadow World, the relationship between the Unlife and the Dark Gods, what we now call the Loremasters gods. Kygar interpreted the Ice source books as saying the Dark Gods and the Unlife worked together in the Wars of Dominion. Those are not part of the history of Atlantia. There is no way to directly translate it into the modern setting. It has to be studied in that very archaic context. Unfortunately, there are no records of further elaboration on this point, as it would have been very helpful to know his interpretations of the source material. For example, he chaired a town forum on March 2, 1994, where the subject was the Dominion Wars / History in Colthea. Knowing what he had to say about that could have helped constrain the possibilities considerably. I'm not going to talk a lot about methodology, subtext, context, possibility spaces. I beat that to death already in my Graveyard series. It all carries over to what I'm doing here. This episode will go over several issues and try to understand the higher concept in the Ice context. I will look at the Wars of Dominion, the conflict that ended the second era of Shadow World. It will start with the source material, then the Gemstone stories set in that time period. As you'll see, this will naturally lead us into talking about Empress Kadaena. I will look at the Broken Lands creatures, which were named in Iruaric. Then I will look at the Dark Shrine, which still has Iruaric writing on it. Kygar modified the Iruaric glossary from the source books, so there are a lot of things about the language that are only true in Gemstone. And I will go over the Temple of Darkness poem, which is what you use with the Iruaric glossary to solve the Dark Shrine puzzle. Then I will look into this business about whether or not the Broken Land is the moon of the Dark Gods. That will lead me to look into various inconsistencies and raise some question marks. And by that point, the episode will be more than long enough. So let's start with the Wars of Dominion. If you have watched the third episode of my Graveyard series, you know the Wars of Dominion evolved as a concept. In the 1980s, the Wars of Dominion were driven by the forces of the Unlife. As if one beast, the Dark Powers rose up and assaulted civilization. This was still true in the 1989 source books, such as the Shadow World Master Atlas, first edition. In the mid-1980s, the Wars of Dominion were led by surviving followers of Empress Kadaena, who had turned to the Unlife for power, having hidden for many years. There was still some vestigial text here and there to that effect in the 1989 books, even some stray bits implying Kadaena was somehow leading the Wars of Dominion, even though Kadaena had been dead for 100,000 years. That was, I argued, important to the Graveyard, which treats her like a dead goddess. But the stuff about Kadaena's surviving followers mostly went away in the books from 1989, which was the synthesis and retcon of older Ice books into Shadow World. That is, the world of Loremaster books synthesized into Shadow World. That was the first edition of the Master Atlas, after all. But some of the material was 5 to 10 years old. Then in 1990 and onward, there was a major expansion to the Shadow World setting, and the Wars of Dominion became led instead by the Dark Lords of Charon. These are the Dark Gods, what we would call the Loremasters gods. Most of those gods did not exist in the 1989 books. Their pantheon first appears in 1990. In fact, in later Shadow World books, the Dark Gods are the primary instigators of the Wars of Dominion, as they were seeking to overthrow the followers of their rivals, the Lords of Orhan, on what we call Liabo. And the other evil factions were sort of just taking advantage of the situation, including the servants of the Unlife. This is a shift in the source material where the Unlife went from being the ultimate source of all evil, that the evil factions all serve it, some united will toward destruction and annihilation, to instead referring mostly to the subtle influence of small cults and cabals. where servants of the absolutist unlife are nihilistic fanatics, essentially terrorists, in the service of total annihilation. But most evil factions, forces of darkness, are instead pursuing more selfish agendas of conquest. They might work with unlife cults, or with what we call harbingers, but to control them as weapons. The dark gods are unrestrained forces of wanton destruction, without any of the subtlety of unlife cultists. The unlife itself evolved from being a malevolent will with many manifestations to just being a corrupting form of energy with no awareness, mindless, the most extreme end of a spectrum of chaos. And you have this notion that other forces of darkness are unwittingly serving the ends of the unlife because of how it corrupts the will. But there's still older texts in these books carried forward into later contexts where the unlife is a singular force and the big bad. So, long story short, you have texts from older books present in later books, mixing together with much newer text. The way I split it all apart by years is much more rigorous than how most people would read it. The way you interpret something like how the dark gods are related to the unlife depends very much on which parts you are reading or emphasizing. Is it the relationship of the dark gods and the unlife itself, or the relationship with powerful forces of the unlife? Those are two very different things, at least after 1989. And unlike the Graveyard, which is only based on the books from 1989, the Broken Lands depends on the 1990 books, maybe even 1992. And those books are not entirely consistent with each other. That makes what we were trying to do here difficult. The actual intent could be based on interpretations of the source material I would want to dismiss as flawed. So even though we will be looking at the world setting context, we still have to do guesswork, because there's a lot of stuff that could be relevant, but that does not necessarily mean it is relevant. When you look at the DI's version of the Uthex Cathaisis story that floated around for years, it said, "From the records of the Broken Lands," and years ago, the sage Uthex Cathaisis was among the greatest researchers and theorists of the time. Contrast that with what the original version actually said. From the records of the Manta Punterken, that's the original Iruaric name for the Broken Land, then you will notice a few of the sentences were actually erased entirely. Namikos Library, which was deiced as Library Biblia, 6521 Second Era, the exact year it happened. The Wars of Dominion took place between 6450 Second Era and 6825 Second Era. So right off the bat, that edit erased the premise of the Broken Lands. Then the missing lines say, Manta Punterken translates literally to the home of broken lore. In the year 6521 of the Second Era, during the early years of the Wars of Dominion, Loremaster Uthex Cathaisis was among the greatest researchers and theorists of the time. Again, the whole premise of it, the Wars of Dominion, gone. You also notice that the word unlife was changed to undead in a few spots, which is severely misleading. Most stuff of the unlife is not undead. I understand why it was done. In the Ice Age, everyone referred to undead creatures as unlife. But some of those unholy or cursed unlife creatures were not undead. Werebears, anyone? Anyone? Bueller? All those unlife creatures were mechanically treated as undead for the Order of Volt. So, ipso facto, they became undead, even in the few cases they shouldn't be. The de-ice term for unlife was actually chaos. Sage is the replacement term for Loremaster. Those are fair replacements. The unlife was associated with chaos after 1989, and the word sages was often used with Loremasters. In the late 2007 retcon, sages became members of the Order of Lorekeepers when they released the Cleric Self-Resurrection spell. Fortunately, I was able to acquire the original version of the Broken Land story from an archive of the Tombs of Colthea, the Ice Age document library, because what was cut out of it was the whole point of the story, which I might say means I rescued both the I.C.E. and OOC statements of its premise from the dustbin of history. The home of broken lore, indeed. So, Uthex was a lore master. The lore masters were leading the forces of light in the Wars of Dominion. In the early years of the Wars of Dominion, the lords of Orhan were not intervening. those gods we call the Pantheon of Liabo. There was some hesitation to intervene, initial dissension in the 1989 Shadow World Master Atlas. But then in the 1990 context, when it was the Dark Gods leading the Wars of Dominion, in fact, they had built up the invasion forces in secret for 2,000 years. It is implied on page 9 of the Master Atlas Addendum that the Lords of Orhan did not intervene to stop the Dark Gods until almost the very end of the Wars of Dominion. There's a scene showing K, who we call Kai, surprising Skalu, who we call Sharu, by suddenly appearing at the Battle of Magris in 6820 Second Era, telling the people to take heart, the Lords of Orhan have joined the fray at long last. That is, their intervention ended the Wars of Dominion after almost 400 years. They were able to imprison, destroy, or banish the Dark Gods, one by one, which would have been impossible for the Loremasters to do by themselves. Andrax is much more powerful than the other Loremasters, being a Lord of Essence, and he was terrified of Skalu. He would not be able to fight a Dark God. The Orhan intervention started a few decades earlier in much later Shadow World books, in 6780 Second Era, when Kor set off planet-wide rainstorms. Ash had darkened the sky for a decade. It can be reconciled by interpreting 6820 as Andrax writing about a few decades earlier, but it was very late in the Wars of Dominion regardless. Given that 1990 context, you have the story of Uthex Cathaesis and the Loremasters. They have to fight the Dark Gods and Ordainers, demons of demigod scale power, without the aid of the Light Gods with their own resources. So that is the context of Uthex researching ways to fight the Unlife, which is to say the forces of the Unlife, which includes not only the Dark Gods, but warlords like Lord Gallus, whose father had served Kadaena in the First Era, or the Master of Malice, a surviving follower of Kadaena, who Andrax slayed at the end of the Wars of Dominion. Most of the Evil Essence Lords are imprisoned on the Eastern Hemisphere beyond the Wall of Darkness, which is a huge energy barrier dividing the world in half. But Uthex had discovered a new source of power, quote-unquote, and was trying to provide this new power with physical form, which implies creating entities out of energy. It was soon twisted and perverted into perilous forms by the subtle influence of the forces of the Unlife. What is all this implying? Well, first, the new source of power is clearly a reference to the Master Atlas section on evil spells, the same place the term Dark Path was almost certainly taken from for the Graveyard story. This is the 1989 framed context where evil spells derive their power from the Unlife. This is perceived as a new power source, wholly in addition to their own by the magic user, because it's different in kind from ordinary magic. In canonical Shadow World, you get a separate set of power points, what we call mana, for evil spells, and using them gradually corrupts your soul. When you cast the first spell, you start down a dark path. When your essence soul meter hits 0, you are totally corrupted and twisted onto evil. It is essentially an alignment where the GM has veto power over your actions. You become a creature of the Unlife, as the Master Atlas words it. The Unlife drives you mad, and you become enslaved. The Council of Light process, essentially. Except in tabletop, it's actually enforced. The more powerful the spellcaster is, the longer it takes to succumb to the Unlife. Very few have managed to do that for long periods of time. Mostly just the Dragon Lords, who draw it indirectly from chaos. Well, in 1989, they followed the Unlife, but not after 1989. They had already changed that by the Jaimon book later in 1989. And the Dragon Lords are kind of evil anyway. In the 1990 context, the Dark Gods are related to the Unlife, but not as far along that negative energy spectrum. They are chaotic manifestations or aspects of the dark energy, so implicitly, or explicitly in much later books, casting spells using their power would corrupt you as well, twisting you into becoming malevolent. It is a kind of metaphysical radiation poisoning. By the way, whenever I say later books, I mean Shadow World or Rolemaster material published after I.C.E. and GemStone split. Anything after 1995. Or earlier if the area I'm talking about was made at an earlier date than a book. And when I say older books, I mean I.C.E. books before 1989, before Shadow World, the world of Loremaster books. So the Dark Gods are independent of the Unlife in the narrow sense, the Dragon Lord sense, but their natures are inherently destructive and malevolent because they are of the Unlife. What is included by the term Unlife depends much on context. You could include all the forces corrupted by dark energy, or manifestations of Unlife, or only servants of the Unlife itself who understand and knowingly pursue the ultimate goal of total annihilation, or you could refer to the Unlife itself, the antithesis of all the rest of existence. So the Wars of Dominion entry on the timeline in Master Atlas Addendum from 1990 says the Unlife was imprisoned on Charon, what we call Lornon, at the end of the Wars of Dominion. Obviously that can't mean the Unlife itself. That wouldn't make any sense. It's minions, manifestations. In the second edition of the Master Atlas in 1992, this wording is changed from the Unlife to Dark Gods imprisoned on Charon. But if you're looking at the 1990 book, you can interpret that as Unlife and Dark Lords together. Or you can interpret it as the Dark Lords are themselves manifestations of the Unlife. In the 1989 books, before the Dark Lords of Charon existed, Charon was associated with servants of the Unlife. There's even a line in the Jaimon book from 1989 about servants of Kadaena making an amulet of Charon, an intelligent evil artifact in the Wars of Dominion, which again was obviously wrong in canon even in the 1989 context. Kadaena should not be served like that in the Second Era. Interestingly, in that Battle of Migris scene with Scalu from the Master Atlas Addendum in 1990, Scalu has legions of demons and an Ordainer demon leading them, but his lieutenants are Heralds of Darkness, what we would call Cheruvian Harbingers. The Heralds of Darkness are actually servants of the Unlife. They are often found serving other forces of darkness. Ordainers are often servants of the Unlife. Forces of the Unlife, Dark Gods, working together. So, the Loremaster documentation from 1989 states that field researchers could be out of contact for long periods of time. The other Loremasters eventually suspected something was wrong and that their fellow Uthex had gone quite mad. They went and tracked him down, fought his perverted creations, and smited him. This is a knowledge too dangerous to possess kind of framework. So they were destroying or removing whatever they could. This notion of the Loremaster sealing the portal with runes of warding comes from the source material. There were major portals that were sources of demons, and the Loremasters wanted to close the portals at the end of the Wars of Dominion, but discovered it was too dangerous. That is something we have mostly lost in post-Ice Gemstone, the idea that portals are very powerful and dangerous. But the Loremasters would ward the portals because it was too dangerous to destroy them. The runes on the stone around the portal might refer to the warding spell list. This is supposed to be treated as an arcane realm list. Few would be able to use it. It has some spells extremely similar to what we see in the Misty Chamber. The most powerful one makes a permanent ward out of a large immobile stone with special materials, where to pass by the stone or through the circle of stones, you have to pass a level check, and attempting to touch the stone inflicts a minor critical and throws you back. Technically it's a warding roll, but in Rolemaster that's level versus level. Now look at what happens when you touch the runes in the Mystic Chamber. You get zapped with a small amount of damage. And if you fail the level check, which was level 28 without rune skill, you get thrown back. We could infer from this that the creator of the ward was level 56, which is very high for the Shadow World setting, but what you might expect for a Loremaster. Apparently back then, the graphical front end, there was a rotating ring image for this room, but I've never seen that image. There's other art for the Broken Lands, which was maybe 1999-ish or 2000. Our front end still shows those. The analogous image for the Misty Chamber shows a stone ring with Germanic runes on it, but the ring isn't spinning, which is a total ripoff. There are some other subtle points in the story. It says that Uthex Cathiasus had used his powerful influence to gain control over the portal. In other words, Uthex had connections with someone else who hooked him up with it. It says his research was twisted into perverted and perilous forms by the subtle influence of the forces of the Unlife. This is beyond Uthex merely having his judgment corrupted by the energies he was using. Uthex was working with people who were actually secretly forces of the Unlife. who were manipulating him into using dark magic and corrupting him. So, what gives? Who dat? Well, look back to the year 6521 of the Second Era and the early years of the Wars of Dominion. Who else was in this region in that exact time period? Bandur and Uthex, who had been recognized by the College of Charon, the Loremaster College, for his research into the ways of the forces of the unlife, whose specialty was the servants of the Shadow, the followers of Kadaena fashioning great demons, and who later usurped his brother's fiefdom, most likely on the eastern shore of the bay, what the story calls the windward edge of the high plateau, which is immediately south of the Sealfar Strait, where this portal is located, and then established an evil theocracy of Empress Kadaena, whose members engaged in a genteel facade of prayer. Where the GemStone unique story for this has Kadaena as a fallen lord of Orhan, the first of some number of moon gods to follow the unlife, which is totally off canon. The wording implies there were other gods corrupted by the unlife. This was before the Charon pantheon was defined. Notice the name of the place, Manta Punterken, is in the language Iruaric. Iruaric is the dead language of the Lords of Essence. Kadaena was the Empress of the Lords of Essence. In fact, Kadaena and her henchmen were responsible for the creation of many travesties of life, most of the dark and monster races, with their depraved experiments. The original names of the creatures in the Broken Lands are in Iruaric as well, which suggests they originated in Lord of Essence experiments, or at least Uthex created them with Essence Lord equipment, which may well have involved speaking Iruaric. This is very strongly implying the Crystal Dome is a Lord of Essence artifact, and it is probably over 100,000 years old from the First Era, 117,000 years ago. Why would these subtle forces of the unlife have needed Uthex, after all, if this Broken Land stuff was made in the Second Era? But then there is something even weirder. The writing on the entrance of the Dark Shrine is Iruaric. The exit with Morgu's statue is also Iruaric. What is weird about this is that the Lords of Essence are from the First Era of Shadow World, but the Dark Gods did not arrive in this universe until the Second Era, which was 100,000 years after the end of the First Era. They are from entirely different time periods. What happened is that in the First Era, the Lords of Essence had constructed major portals which had weakened the barriers between planes of existence. This is how the unlife entered this universe, corruptive dark essence, malevolent manifestations. There was a great deal of demonic incursion through them in the Lord of Essence Civil War. There were some Lord of Essence portals on the moon, Charon. Then there was a comet called Charon, which swings by Colthea, Shadow World, roughly every 1,500 years. And something about this comet disrupts the flows of essence. When it came through around 1900 Second Era, Charon passed through its tail, and it interacted with the dormant portals on Charon. And that is what caused the Dark Gods and Servants of the Unlife to begin appearing on that moon. There is some inconsistency on the dates between the books. In later Shadow World books, they first appeared on Charon in the 450 Second Era pass of the comet, and the 1900 Second Era pass made it easier for them to access the world. In this accounting, the Lords of Orhan first made themselves known in 450 Second Era to counter them. But that was not established yet, even in the second edition Master Atlas in 1992. So, Servants of the Unlife first began appearing around 2000 Second Era because of the portals. In the Emer book from 1990, it jointly speaks of Dark Gods and Servants of the Unlife on Charon. Interestingly, it refers to the Dark Gods as evil manifestations of the Unlife. The glossary in Emer 1990 actually says they might be allied with the Unlife. The Emer book and the Master Atlas Addendum, by the way, came together in the same box set, but it speaks of them having been imprisoned on Charon. This is loose wording. The Dark Gods have a limited ability to travel down to the world. They just cannot access the portals, which are now guarded. In 1989, these were called the Gates of the Void. In later books, this was clarified. they were really imprisoned on Charon in the Third Era until the comet let them escape in 2625 Third Era, which explains why the Lords of Orhan, who mostly disappeared after the Wars of Dominion, engaged with the world again in 3000 Third Era and onward. But bottom line, the Dark Gods arrived in this universe through ancient Lord of Essence portals on Charon, and the Wars of Dominion involved other ancient portals being ripped open by the comet. If you look in the Master Atlas Addendum from 1990, those portals were often opened with powerful crystals, but there is no defined relationship between the Dark Gods and Lords of Essence in canon. In the later Shadow World books, there's an addition to the timeline that says some Loremasters theorize the Dark Gods originated in Lord of Essence experiments attempting to create non-corporeal life. The earliest mention of that I can find in Shadow World source books is not until 1998. But the implication here is clear. The Dark Gods and the Lords of Essence, there is some relationship between them in the Broken Lands. So, why would there be Iruaric on the entrance to the Vrul? Well, there's a big glaring reason for it. Vrul were originally called Gogor. Gogor were invented by Empress Kadaena herself way back in the first era of Shadow World. Kadaena was attempting to make artificial life, which is to say unliving abominations, though she was never able to make any that could reproduce themselves. These were all malevolent constructs, Gogor, shards, Khaden, sort of like golems or gargoyles, but far more complex. Shards and Khaden were first mentioned in a poem at the beginning of the Jaimon book in 1989. Well, shards date back to 1985 in Creatures and Treasures 1, but I mean in Shadow World specifically. The Khaden were not actually defined until the Master Atlas Addendum in 1990. There were shards in Northwest Jaimon in the Forest of Deer, Northwest Jaimon 1989, more specifically Deer 1990. I mentioned the Forest of Deer in the first episode of this series, and in more detail in the third episode of my Graveyard series. Incidentally, Kay's spear was defined as Deerwood in 1989, but Deer was undefined until 1990 as well. I forgot to mention that when I talked about the Fellwood chairs in the first episode. Kay again is Kai. These names are fluidly interchangeable in my head. Cheruvian is a cool word, cooler than Scalian. But Scalo just sounds mean. But there's a whole section on constructs, which are just these inventions by Empress Kadaena. Gogor were found in ancient crypts and awoken by dark priests in the Second Era. They had slumbered for 100 millennia in tall stone jars, which are filled with a foul fluid that nourishes them. Thalia, I'm told, referred to them as pickles. Thalia was the first person to kill Gogor. It supposedly bled out later, which sounds weird. One of the doors in the shrine had to be unlocked. Annoyingly, I do not know which one. It was most likely the room with the stone jars and urns with the black fluid. But then they found the secret room behind the tapestry at the altar. You can see the rose and rose line in the source book is quoted in the Broken Lands with the tall stone jars. So there's nothing incongruous in itself about finding the Iruaric language with Gogor, because of their origins in Empress Kadaena and the Lords of Essence. But there's more to it than that, because in the source books, Morgu would plunder ancient crypts, collecting the Gogor as his favorite pets. Moreover, Morgu's physical incarnation resembles a Gogor, which is left unexplained. He has the glowing green eyes, the wings, the bloody red claws, no tentacles. That was a post-Ice Age thing, Marlu having tentacles. Gogor actually have long, prehensile poisonous tails. That's represented in the Dark Shrine statue, though they weirdly have red eyes in that. I think everyone imagines the Vrul as having horns, but it does not actually say that anywhere. You know, like Chernobog, Night on Bald Mountain from the end of Fantasia. Give them a battle axe, and that's how we all imagine the Vrul. In much later Shadow World books, their faces are described as somewhat reptilian. The Vrul also sniff the air if you are dead or otherwise hidden, because Gogor have an extremely acute sense of smell. Gogor are not undead in canon, though they're certainly unliving. It's better to think of them as like leathery gargoyles. They're treated as undead in GemStone mechanically. What is the definition of undead anyway? Can't just be a trapped spirit. That includes all constructs. I could go into that, but I'm not going to get into that in this series. But here, Morgu's name and statue are involved with the dead language, made part of the ancient crypt itself. That poem I mentioned was expanded for the construct section in the Master Atlas Addendum of 1990. It was not included in the artificial being section of the 1992 Master Atlas. Once she whispered and life was death, Gogor arose, his wide wings spread, talons to tear and fangs to feed. The skies were darkened with dread. The she in this stanza, of course, is referring to Empress Kadaena, but Gogor is intriguing, worded as a named individual. It would not be a big stretch to guess this is Morgu, that Morgu was fashioned as some master Gogor. Andrax wrote the poem in 1782 Second Era, which was about a century before the Dark Lords arrived on Charon. So if it did refer to Morgu, it would mean the Dark Gods were here earlier in the First Era. Remember, Andrax was a cousin of Kadaena. He was around in the First Era. I'll come back to this poem a bit later. In the Graveyard series, I talked a lot about Empress Kadaena and the way she was treated in that story. The Graveyard seems to lean on a brief whirlwind history in the 1989 Adventure modules, which is vestigial text carried forward from older ICE books, which is less than consistent with the Shadow World books. That has a typo, for example, implying Kadaena was a Lord of Orhan in the First Era. The backstory for the Graveyard intentionally leans into this typo. It calls her the first Lord of Orhan to follow the Unlife, which implies Kadaena is a dark goddess and that there are other dark gods, which could easily be twisted in the later context into the Dark Lords were once Lords of Orhan, that they split into their own factions, sort of like Lornon and Liabo did with Atlantia, which is one of the Loremaster theories on the origins of the Dark Lords. But it could also mean something else, that the Dark Gods were made by the Lords of Essence, which is also a Loremaster theory in the later books, but I cannot find it before 1998. There is also a theory that they were escaping some interdimensional prison. There's also a Loremaster theory that the Lords of Orhan are just refugee Lords of Essence from the First Era. That is supposed to be wrong in canon, but GemStone is free to do its own thing, so who knows. The role of the deities and Lord of Essence stuff from the First Era is explicitly left undefined in the source books. Something weird with that vestigial history is that it says Kadaena's surviving followers, the servants of the Shadow, who had turned to the Unlife for power, had fashioned the first of the great demons. I explained in the Graveyard series that in older ice books, such as the Cloud Lords of Tanara from 1984, the Lords of Essence were thought to have artificially created the demons, even though demons are supposed to be extraplanar, and the demonic later turned to the Unlife. I was also giving an interpretation of the coastal cliffs as suggesting that Bandur had made demons of the Pale, especially the Sixth Pale, as creatures of his own creation. So we have this situation of the Gogor, which are artificial constructs, and the possibility that the dark gods were made artificially. Morgu was actually a dark spirit, one of the lesser gods. Dark spirits were already made artificially. The Dark Lords make the dark spirits as servants and can unravel the essence of the dark spirits at will, which is even more intriguing given GemStone's precedent of treating Kadaena as a dark goddess. What about the creatures in the Broken Lands? The Uthex Catheus' story speaks of his experiments with giving power a physical form, and we have the Crystal Dome, which is constantly absorbing power. The story speaks of the Loremasters having to fight off Uthex's creations. So we have creatures being made and or augmented artificially, possibly fashioned out of the essence itself. That suggests we should look at the creatures in the Broken Lands a little more closely. Gogor originated with Empress Kadaena, malevolent artificial life. But it is not clear the minor Gogor of the Dark Shrine date back to the First Era. They are relatively small, their wings look too small for flight. Which, the flying creature mechanic didn't exist yet. There's no indication that they have poisonous tails. And there is a tapestry depicting a brutal sacrifice ritual involving urns of the foul black fluid, which may very well be implying dark priests gain knowledge of the Gogor creation methods. and the Gogor are born of death in a sense through a necromantic ritual. Perhaps corpses transformed inside the stone jars in that foul fluid. That phrase is evocative of an unnatural life cycle. Their unlife cycle, to coin a phrase. There are corpses in the Dark Shrine crypt, which must be Morgu or unlife cultists, and the library is burned, the stone is smashed in various places. It suggests at least that the Loremasters fought things up there, leaving the tall jars alone so as to not wake the things up. It doesn't really make sense for this to have happened later, after the portal was sealed off and monastery founded. The Gogor properties are somewhat off-canon. Their essence realm immunity, the energy blast from their skin. They're immune to weapons under 3x or maybe 4x enchantment, something around that number. None of that comes from the source books. Regardless, the important thing for us at the moment is the theme. They are malevolent artificial life. The other creatures lack this canon origin in Lords of Essence. They were given Iruaric names, which, as I said, suggests Lord of Essence origins, or at the very least, origins of Lord of Essence artifacts that use Iruaric. But do they have other names in the Rolemaster bestiaries? When you look around the Creatures and Treasures 2 monster manual from 1989, there's a section on specific non-demon extraplanar entities. What they have in common beyond this is typically coexisting or wandering between planes of existence. Some of these entities are strikingly similar to the Broken Lance creatures. They're not identical, but then they should be mutants, not identical, because Uthex's work was being twisted into more perilous forms. What we call Magru are very similar to the Absorbers. These are fat blobs that secrete acid all over their bodies, burning their foes by touch, and which reproduce by absorbing the flesh of their victims. They are very anxious to get to other planes to obtain more food and come through portals in great numbers, which implies they are like an invasive species wiping out the fauna of the plains. This is remarkable given the deep bone pit in the Magru tunnels, which have all sorts of animals which are no longer present. What are, or were in some cases, the Magru properties. The Magru are immune to heat, and hitting them with non-magical weapons would make the weapon dissolve from the highly corrosive acid, back when there was a breakage system. They would unstun each other and would get enraged by their brethren getting killed, which plus 25 boosted their attacks, and would incite them to attack with the acid spray maneuver more frequently. Sharp weapons pass right through them without doing any damages. Then there's the Iruaric, a non-corporeal being of unknown energy, making its victim feel cold chills. They appear only as darkness when detected magically with light, and they attack with tendrils. When you casted light on vortices, it damaged them and prevented them from attacking. Interestingly, the Play.net description of dark vortices is expanded compared to what's currently in the game itself, speaking of the unknown origins of the dark vortices to researchers. The current description might have gotten truncated. They feed on the minds of their victims, but there's another entity, the Black Heart, which are floating black spheres. When they strike their victims, they inflict cold criticals, like the dark vortices. This might have something to do with the hazy tenebrous orbs. Then we have the Dictics, which are abnormally heavy, dense, though small, extraplanar insects, which devour anything. Their chitin is the strength of fine steel. Giant fog beetles used to be puncture immune. This may also be a hybrid concept. Giant beetles are in the bestiaries as poisonous, and the jet spray of the giant fog beetles is poisonous. Dictics on a plane are all of the same variety, but they wander between the planes. Extraplanar bedbugs, basically. Extraplanar large beetles exist in Dungeons & Dragons as well. They are called bone spears, which is interesting. There were giant fog beetles outside Bone Spear Tower at first. There were also dust beetles in Shadow Valley in the beginning. Then it gets even more interesting. You have the crystals, which are large, sharp crystal formations which barely move, and they exist in many places or many planes simultaneously. They are huge repositories of extraplanar information. You communicate with them using mental spells. Recall what I said in the first episode. Rikarth remembers being able to cast Forget on the crystals, which surround the jagged plane and are described as wildly growing. Then there are the Horde, which are collective mud entities forming humanoid shapes out of colonies. They are in simultaneous communication with the whole collective of mud entities. They are dimensional nomads and are found on many planes of existence. So you have the southern side of the jagged plane, which is a huge sea of boiling mud. And these are all room objects, which means they were probably casting targets when the puzzle still existed for turning off the crystal dome. If this conjecture is correct, the dome is implicitly drawing upon vast amounts of extraplanar information and reaching in some way across many other planes of existence. This is, I think, consistent with my more allegorical theories. There are many other non-demon entities which are not represented, though I will bring up the Trog later. At one point I thought the Zastal could be relevant. They have the greatest understanding of magical and extraplanar knowledge in all of existence. They are floating octopus-like things which look extremely similar to Kashtakai's Old Fashional's tentacle avatar. But I ruled this out because the earliest description matching those tightly was in a much later book. There's also nothing resembling the Kiska rocks, what we now call Miklian. But there's a striking parallel here that explains much of what we see, and recall the story calls the place another plane of existence. Bringing this back into context, the story says the forces of the unlife were subtly influencing Uthex into twisting his work into more perilous forms. Well, if Uthex was working with fashioning extraplanar entities out of energy, and he was eventually corrupted by the dark power of the unlife, the obvious implication is they wanted to make demons, that is, manifestations of the unlife, so to speak. And if you can make demons artificially, and the most powerful demons are essentially demigods, and the Dark Lords themselves are extraplanar and came from the demonic planes, it is not difficult to imagine the Dark Gods could have originated this way, which are themselves chaotic manifestations of the anti-essence, the unlife. Uthex would have wanted to make entities powerful enough to fight them. Interestingly, Shar wanted to use the Broken Lands because she was on a quest for ascension. That might be a coincidence after the fact, after the Ice Age, but it is worth noting. Shar also did a massive Troll King invasion where the trolls were worshipping the Unlife, which was remarkable because the Unlife does not exist post-Ice as such. Anyway, this notion of the servants of Kadaena fashioning great demons is in the Whirlwind history, which is near the beginning of the adventure modules from 1989, including Kelborn, the one where GemStone was based. And actually, since the shards of the Force of Deer woke up there and Shar T had served Kadaena in the First Era, it follows naturally that Kadaena directly controlled this region during the Civil War final conflict between the Lords of Essence. Those references associating Kadaena with the Wars of Dominion were fixed in 1990. This section on her flame demon bodyguards, for example, was reworded, saying final conflict, the First Era, instead of Wars of Dominion. But there's nothing stopping you from using the 1989 books. So that brings us to what the Dark Shrine says. But to do that, we have to look at Iruaric first. There's an Iruaric glossary in the 1990 Master Atlas Addendum and in the 1992 Master Atlas. Kygar was using the one from 1990 because it is missing the same two words, pillar and gods. Those were overlooked in the first glossary. But they were already defined in the 1989 books because the pillar of the gods was mentioned in the first Master Atlas. Some of the Iruaric words had known meanings before the glossary in the same way. There would be a name for something and another name for it in Iruaric. That's how Kadaena Throck Farok predated the glossary. At one point I thought this might be relevant because the Pillar of the Gods was formed in a cataclysm when the Lords of Orhan first arrived in this dimension. Talon Isle through the old Dangerland obelisk is pretty obviously an homage to it from 2016. That obelisk was overtly treated as a throwback reference to the Navigators. There's even a Prim Navigator spirit beast for it. The Pillar of the Gods is a huge spire of volcanic glass surrounded by essence and space-time distortions and the source of Kadaena's Shadowstone amulet. It is actually formed by a tiny black hole hitting Colthea in the eastern hemisphere and passing through the other side of it. But since those words are just missing in one glossary, it turns out it is only a coincidence. There are other reasons, such as Alora's Shrine, showing Kagari used the 1990 book. So Kagari took the 1990 glossary for Iruaric and added a bunch of non-canonical notes for how the language works. In canon, Iruaric is a dead language known by very few, and spoken rightly, it is partly telepathic, because the Lords of Essence had telepathic and other innate psionic abilities. Loremasters are among those the books explicitly say know some Iruaric. So this Manta Punterkin thing and Uthex is consistent with that. Telepathy, by the way, is suppressed in the Broken Lands. Unless the ESP changes last year broke that. It probably did break that, but I'll have to check. Presumably, telepathy is suppressed by the Crystal Dome, but not necessarily. It is possible the Loremasters did something to suppress it because of this possibly telepathic aspect of Uthex's work. Telepathy may have been suppressed if it is involved in how the creatures are controlled by the creators. In fact, in 1994, it was not possible to have familiars in the Broken Lands, though that could also have been more mundane, not being able to bring them through the portal and not having any indigenous wildlife on that side to be a familiar. Other stuff didn't work too, gold rings, transference. Some of that might have been about blocking people from getting around the level and skill check to enter the Broken Land. Because remember, back then there were not any other towns, places that were too far away for those spells. With the case of familiars, though, the familiar gate spell did not exist until several years later. There were any number of mechanics-based subtleties that might not be there anymore. But digression aside, the apostrophe forms of Iruaric in canon are older forms of it. In Kagar's version, those are later forms of it. But what he might really be talking about are even older forms than the apostrophe syllable breaks, in which case there is no contradiction. The smooth forms of Iruaric are just that much later. In this image, I've bolded his modifications and italicized the sourcebook parts. He introduces a lot of language rules which have the effect of flexibility in word interpretation. Something he introduces is the idea that ancient Iruaric was written hieroglyphically, and that more modern forms of the language were written phonetically. Hieroglyphs actually are phonetic, so that's not the best way to word it. That's why the Rosetta Stone was the key to deciphering them. But he seems to mean the glyphs are more like ideograms, where variations in how they are drawn convey nuances of meaning. Or more specifically, some of these hieroglyphs act as ideograms, while others act as logograms. Similar written glyphs would represent many aspects of the same idea or word, which is basically Kaigar saying there's multiple meanings in his terms, which perhaps is encoding the telepathic aspects in writing. I mean, think about it. If you have a telepathic dimension to spoken language, how would you write down the words in that language? You might have glyphical symbols for whole words or ideas, but ancillary variations in how they are drawn to convey more meaning or multiplicities of meaning. The premise he gives is that it is difficult to translate the ancient language into more modern forms of the same language, by which I think he mostly means transliteration of hieroglyphic Iruaric into alphabetic Iruaric, less than, say, trying to convert Middle English into modern English, though there's a little bit of that at the end. And after all, the Iruaric that is spoken in the second or third era is debased. It lacks a telepathic dimension. So even a spoken word in ancient Iruaric would not necessarily be conveyed by speaking the same modern word. I might be scrubbing the threads harder than they were weaved. There's always a risk of overanalysis. But one point of this that is difficult is what he means by ancient and modern. Ancient Iruaric is obviously from the first era, over 100,000 years ago. It is less obvious what modern means. It could mean the debased Iruaric used by very few people in the second era, or it can mean the Iruaric used toward the end of the first era. That is, the time of Empress Kadaena and their civil war. Late in the first era would naively make more sense because it's a dead language, except he speaks of phonetic representations varying widely between cultures, which is a little weird. And the source book does say later written forms smooth the words for human tongues. That has to refer to the innocuous forms that are learned by other races. Either way, we run into historical paradoxes. The graveyard story, by the way, spoke of Kadaena being an Iluarian phrase, which is one of the elven races, even though those words are Iruaric, though Iluari itself is Iruaric, the Lord of Essence name for them, meaning beauties or those who are beautiful, something like that. And one of Kygar's idiosyncratic language rules is that the word Iluari, the Y transposed to the wrong spot, is a pluralization of the word Ilar, where Ilar is not a word in the Iruaric glossaries. Ilya instead is beautiful. So he went deliberately off canon on that example, which is interesting. It suggests vowels like Y might be in the wrong spot. One frustrating thing about his Iruaric glossary is that near the end it has a truncated line or lines. This happened with the Iruaric Reach story too, but unfortunately the full version of that survived somehow. I've never seen what the missing sentences were in the modified Iruaric glossary. It was probably important because it's talking about ancient Iruaric, which, hints at its relevance to the Broken Lands. The truncated line is most ancient forms of the language before the glottal stops and the early forms developed fully into vowels. So what's going on here is he's saying very ancient Iruaric was glottalized, that these glottal stops are where the apostrophes went in the later alphabetic written forms of the language. But later spoken forms of the language would not be written with apostrophes because it would be vowel sounds. Glottal stops are dropped sounds, air breaks between sounds, like when Teletubbies say, uh-oh. Glottalized T, for example, in Cockney English makes butter be pronounced butter, and you would write butter with an apostrophe between the U and the E. That suggests when we see missing sounds in his Iruaric terms, and there's a bunch of those, is a phonetic, which is to say alphabetic transcription of ancient Iruaric from a form of the language before those glottal stops fully developed into vowel sounds. It seems to suggest the apostrophe form itself should imply an old dialect of Iruaric, which implicitly dates the Dark Shrine and the creatures back to an ancient speaker, where the source books say that ancient form has unknown powers over the essence. It's also speaking of word parts being incorporated into a single glyph. So he was talking about the ancient written forms of the language, which he has as hieroglyphic, which means we should expect his Iruaric to be fusions of word parts with missing sounds, and that there may be multiple aspects of meaning in these fused words, which do not translate, so to speak, well out of glyphical form. The notion that literal translations of Iruaric into more modern Iruaric fail to represent the original ideas accurately suggests we have to interpret some of those words loosely. He also says word part order does not imply language syntax. Kunterkin, for example, is actually lore broken, rather than the provided broken lore. So let's look at examples. Dark vortices were originally called Dayar Rakul. This naively can be parsed two ways. Dayar Rakul is dark power shadows, while Dayar Rakul is dark cold shadows. Since it is fused into Rakul, it can be both simultaneously. The Dayar Rakul are shadow creatures which both drain power from their victims and inflict cold criticals. They would drain the power from everyone in the room simultaneously and pull people out of hiding. Occasionally they would wander into the dark shrine. Gogor originally were not on the stairs. Actually, the Gogor used to hit you with unbalance without a warding roll and ran more if isolated than in groups. The RT on that huge stairway was higher for shorter races. I'm not sure offhand if it still is. Kind of offsets not having to kneel to walk in the McGrew tunnels. I'm digressing. Dark vortice is straightforward in meaning they are vortices of darkness. Their hazy tenebrous orbs are probably some weird life cycle thing. The impression I get is the Dark Grotto is self-consciously, as a concept, not supposed to be just weird stuff, but a weird otherworldly ecosystem, something self-contained with a consistent internal logic. Because there's arguably stuff representing all of their different life cycle stages. McGrew formed the habitat itself. They must presumably eat the occasional lizard. Maybe I had it backwards and the stone spheres are essentially McGrew eggs. The McGrew encase their budding in stones, which gestate and hatch by burning their way out. It's even plausible the black fluid in the Gagor jars was from the McGrew, and it might be that the Gagor are grown in those stone jars. That smell from the fluid is everywhere in the Broken Lands, even Uthex's workshop. But vortices wander into the huge cavern and naturally dissipate, which can cause hazy tenebrous orbs to drop. They only shrink and lose intensity when they move away from the rooms along the northern wall, which is where the huge stairwell is, just at higher elevation. Or it could somehow be because they are crossing the stream of water, or it might be that the light is too bright away from the wall. Vortices do not attack you when they are shrinking. They are immune to a lot of stuff. That should probably be interpreted as Uthex modifying the creatures to make them more difficult to kill. You have common themes like cold crits, crit type immunities, power draining or backlash. Then you have the Kiska Rax, which means chilling claw in Iruaric. These are the Mictlean. Their claws unleash cold flares. They are immune to cold. Weapons can bounce off them. I do not know if Mictlean should mean anything. It could be an anagram for many ilk, because they have a color spectrum. Least energy light, red light, is the weakest Mictlean. Up through purple, the highest energy light, is strongest, which is remarkable because the crystal dome flashes with dim multicolored lights. Specifically, their plate is luminescent, glowing like the cavern fungus. I suspect the idea is the lizards eat the fungus and grow into Mictlean. Then they eventually differentiate into the colors. Their properties varied by their color. Red had a bonus against Shock Bolt, yellow against Firebolt, blue against Fireball, and purple against all three of them. Young Mictlean had a small penalty. Orange was neutral, and green and purple had an attack bonus. I'm wording this stuff in the past tense because I do not feel like testing it right now. Their frequency by color type seems to have gone as 1/2 geometrically. Red is 1/2, orange is 1/4, yellow is 1/8. Discontinuity with the young Mictlean at 1/16. But otherwise it is following the order of the color spectrum, Roy G. Biv. Higher the frequency of light, lower the frequency of spawning, the stronger the Mictlean, except for the young ones. No idea if the stronger Mictlean should be interpreted as just being older, that is, if the color evolves, blue shifts with their age. Character age used to work as plus 1 year per level. So the frequency would be dropping off because half as many survive that much longer. But it might be determined by, say, which kind of fungus it was eating. Though I would point out the cavern is very gray. There are only hints of color from fungus. So there's a much more fascinating possibility, the way I would have done it. But I will cover that in the third episode. An allegory of the cave, so to speak. Then you have the McGrew. Those are a mouthful and a lot to unpack. Those were named Lugshuk Trogalok. This translates roughly as ugly fiery cave makers, which makes sense since the room painting implies they made the Dark Grotto. Grotto, after all, is the word you would use for artificial caves. Lug means ugly. Trog naively is trog for cave. This would be the transliteration variation between cultures in the modified glossary. But interestingly, trog with an O is used as well. It is the puzzle for returning from the Dark Shrine. You say Dire Trog to return to the Dark Cavern. Circle that and put a question mark over it. Shook is not a word part. It is apparently a glottalized fusion of word parts. Shu would be fire, and Shulu would be wet, and Hulkanen means barren. So it might well be a fusion of 3 word parts, Shu, Shulu, Hulk, with a glottalization of the ul sound. Fiery, wet, and some connotation of making barren or empty. Recall the huge bone pit and their acid spray. Though there are hints that what they leave behind is a substrate that the fungus grows upon well. The McGrew are immune to fire, and interestingly, they have never roamed into the bone pit, which, as I addressed in episode 1, was given a non-sequential real room ID. The bone pit is kind of a snare. You would get trapped down there if you did not have enough climbing skill. Less of an issue now. Think Silence of the Lambs. You couldn't teleport out of it, and Magru burn the flesh, so it puts the lotion on its skin. Most subtly of all is the Trog is spelled with an A, because as I mentioned before, the section on non-demonic extraplanar entities included Trog, double A. It would sound like Trog spelled with an O. That's from the Rolemaster Beast series, and Iruaric is specific to Shadow World. You could run some other campaign setting using Rolemaster, and it wouldn't have Iruaric in it. So it's a coincidence in canon. But Trog were cave-dwelling, huge Black Panther things, with double rows of poisonous teeth, poisonous claws, and summoning demons. Then you look at Locke, and there is a discrepancy. In the source books, the word Locke only means lost, and the word Levan means maker. But in our modified glossary, the word Locke means both lost and maker. The word Levan was removed and replaced with Locke. So in Troglock, you have a double meaning of making and losing the caves, perhaps referring to the emptying quality of the Magru. But if Trog is also a double meaning, referring to those extraplanar cave cats, it is implying there used to be Trog, but the Magru ate them. That is, they were lost, and making also refers to the reproduction of Magru from flesh, which is how the absorbers reproduce themselves in the Rolemaster bestiaries. Trog and demons never harm each other, but absorbers are not demons. Now, most difficult of all, we have to look at the Dark Shrine. The writing on there still to this day is in Iruaric. It was never de-iced for whatever reason. Or rather, only Morgu was de-iced, changed to Marlu, probably during the auto-conversion. I'm always reluctant to draw attention to stuff like this because it makes me afraid someone will take it upon themselves to fix it. Someone asked what Haris are once, which still appeared in a couple of spots, and a GM went and changed it to squirrel. That's like if the Velnalin had instead been changed to the word deer. Carnalin were not deer, they were a kind of deer from this region. If you're going to do something unnecessary like that, people, at least change it to something distinct and recognizably similar, like Haris to Horis. There are literally dozens of words in the game that did not get de-iced. Whole areas of the game would need to be rewritten if there was ever a serious copyright dispute. There are entire rooms that are nearly copy and paste out of the source books, which, it's been over 25 years. But anyway, it would have said, Morgu licks this court, throw Diar Kamar. And then you say, Lothal Tashin. This is from the Temple of Darkness poem that was made for the Broken Lands. Marlu, cruel master, guard the Dark Queen, spirit born of death. This is one of several examples of off-canon descriptions. There is no basis in the source books for Morgu being the guardian of a Dark Queen, or this notion of spirit born of death, though he is wantonly cruel. First, look at Lixidus, which is not a word. It is the hardest of all to parse. Lix means dread. Addis, it has to be some mutation. I think the T should more normally be an R, Aris. And then that could again be dropping the ul sound. So the ancient speaker of Iruaric would really be saying the word Arulus, seer, which is Lixarulus, meaning dreadseer. Morgu licks this court, Morgu, master of the dreadseers. These would be the Vrul, because the Gagor filled the skies with dread in the First Era. They can be interpreted as seers for Kadaena. Interestingly, if you interpret Vrul as having a glottalized ul and a, Varul, instead of fusion of Vularul or Volarul, then the word Vrul can be interpreted as Iruaric for enchanter's sight or enchanted sea. Whether or not that was intentional, I have no idea. It would depend on who renamed them Vrul. It would not be unprecedented. Lone and Fashlne is Iruaric for spirit of the past, and Phone, which replaced Phaon, is Iruaric for travel, which would fairly obviously refer to the sun. Those are just Easter eggs, obviously. So this is basically saying Morgu, master of the Vrul, and it is written in Iruaric, which altogether suggests Morgu was in deep antiquity the head Vrul. The Gagor filling the skies with dread in Andrax's poem. That is not the only way to interpret it. You could also read this as the act or state of causing dread, which is closer to the Cruel Master translation, Morgu as a manifestation of dread. Then you have this line after it, Thro Daiar Khmer, which in the Temple of Darkness poem is Guard the Dark Queen. We are biased toward interpreting that as Guard Eargina, because Eargina is the queen of the dark gods. It is difficult to catch something like this because we unconsciously bring our own anachronisms with us when we read stuff, which is why you hear me being so careful with dates, because I know a lot of stuff from later materials, which can easily corrupt original intent analysis if I'm not being very careful. But Orgiana is not Queen of the Dark Gods in the Shadow World setting. The Dark Lords are rivals, not a true pantheon, and Orgiana is certainly not their leader. When you see Dark Queen in Iruaric, or in the context of the Gogor, that is implying Empress Kadaena. Look at the sentinels on the next page from the Gogor. Kadaena is called the Dark Queen, and the Khaden, insectoid artificial constructs, are organized under hive queens, where Kadaena herself is the High Queen of the Khaden. Daiar Khmer more literally is translated as Dark Female Lord. Thro is Throk for guard, with a glottalized K, again implying an ancient speaker of Iruaric. Kadaena means slayer, something carried forward from older ice books, but Kadaen literally means elder lord or high lord. Figuratively, Kadaena means queen or empress with slaying connotations. So Morgu is the master of her Gogor, and his job is to guard Empress Kadaena. In the source books, Kadaena used flame demons as bodyguards, and there's a buried detail in the Emer book where Kadaena had an ordainer of demon bodyguard called Morlock. Morlock was given an Iruaric name, Shurox, which means Fireclaw. But this is interesting because dark spirits are only servants of dark lords. They are made by the dark lords to serve them. Morgu should not be a dark spirit for Kadaena unless Kadaena is herself a dark lord. Meanwhile, we can look at Orgiana, whose treatment in the poem is weird. Orgiana, mother of darkness, repose in silent waiting, with revanche to come. So this is interesting. Orgiana is the goddess of darkness. Daiar Khmer as Dark Lady or Lady of Darkness would fit her, or for that matter, the female Dark Lord. The only other was Enos, who we call Evis. But there is nothing off for Enos in the poem. She does not seem relevant. Orgiana is called cruel beyond belief in the source material, which could make her sensibly master of the wantonly cruel Morgu, and she had demonic servants in older source material. But there's little sense of her being mother, and Morgu is born of death. In fact, from 1990 onward, Orgiana is defined as having an intense loathing of men, and repose and silent waiting is implying Orgiana is herself dead. Empress Kadaena is the one who is dead, and yet arguably worshipped as a dead goddess in the graveyard, and dark spirits ought to only be serving dark lords. So Orgiana is an interesting case because unlike most of the dark gods, she existed in an earlier book. Orgiana was the ruler of a pantheon of dark gods in a demonic plane called the Black Hell, which presumably, as a retcon, would have been a sub-pantheon of Charon. She was rumored to have fled to Charon. That's the earliest reference to the idea of a dark god being on that moon. That's why Terry Amthor included Orgiana with the Dark Lords of Charon in the first place, as a relative afterthought for the Orgiana concept. This is from the Demons of the Burning Night book from 1989. Her temple might have influenced the Graveyard Crypt, which I covered in my Graveyard series, episode 3. And the ruler of the Black Hell theocracy in southwest Jaimon in the Second Era was Empress Kadaena's surviving mortal daughter, Varama Ver. There's no explanation in that book of any link between Kadaena and the Black Hell gods in antiquity, but Orgiana has two symbols in the theocracy, the helm of Kadaena and a skull, where Orgiana is drawn in the book as holding a skull in her hands, and Empress Kadaena was decapitated by her cousin Utha. Uthex sounds conspicuously similar to Utha, by the way. Utha was Andrax's father. Also, Morgu's statue in the Dark Shrine has him standing on a pile of skulls, which has no obvious canonical motivation. But if Morgu is a servant of Kadaena or Orgiana based on Burning Night, then the skulls would make sense. But Kadaena is referred to as the Sleeping Queen in a couple of poems in the ruins of that theocracy. Her fake sarcophagus is next to the portal that leads to Orgiana in the Black Hell. The threat is whoever disturbs the Sleeping Queen will be tormented by Orgiana. The Black Hell gods are known as the dead gods of Aranmore. So in the later Shadow World books, this is only indirectly mentioned that Orgiana had her servant spirits destroyed in the Purge during the Wars of Dominion, and she alone escaped back to Charon. But there's no mention of her having been queen or ruler of her own pantheon. And there's no indication that she ruled over the other dark godlings. All she has for this theme is a tiara of torment. And this is contradicted by Demons of the Burning Night as well as in the later Shadow World books, because she is rumored to have fled Charon, but she was actually banished to the Black Hell, which incidentally requires her to have been part of the Charon pantheon in the Second Era, while ruler of her Black Hell pantheon, because she is not present in the Third Era. This repose and silent waiting with revenge to come is interesting, because in the Burning Night book it talks about her wanting revenge on this world. And the book also talks about rumors of Kadaena coming back for revenge. But there is nothing about waiting for revenge in Orgiana's Dark Lords of Charon description, and this line resembles the Kadaena poems where she's sleeping and waiting, which are the two spots I think may have influenced the Graveyard Crypt. The Helm of Kadaena retains part of Kadena's consciousness, and those are the spots where the helm was kept. So this version of Orgiana in the Temple of Darkness poem makes sense if Kygar used Demons of the Burning Night. And if he did that, he would know Empress Kadaena's daughter was the ruler of Orgiana's theocracy. That there's this weird unexplained proximity between Orgiana and Empress Kadaena in that book. There's an inconsistent date in that book, but Kadaena's daughter was a contemporary of Uthex. In the Graveyard series I mentioned, Bonespear Tower is ruled by a demon named Malskari, and Bonespear wanted to imprison the demon into a huge misshapen sword, which is a throwback reference to a scimitar that exists in the game, where a Slayer demon of the Black Hell is imprisoned in the sword, according to the auction when it was released. And it talks to the wielder about killing with the aid of Malskari. Demons of the Black Hell were made artificially as servants for the Black Hell gods. Malskari, a demon lord from the Rolemaster B series, is an ordainer. Those two kinds of demons should have nothing to do with each other. They are supposed to have completely different origins. I do not know the full motivation for all that, but as I said, Kygar's memorial is in the Bonespear Tower courtyard. In any case, it is plausible the Black Hell material for Orgiana is relevant to the Temple of Darkness poem and this Iruaric version. You have this interesting situation where Dayar Khmer can refer to Kadaena and Orgiana simultaneously. And the Graveyard's backstory says Kadaena was the first of the moon gods to follow the Unlight. There's a thread here for thinking Empress Kadaena may have become Orgiana. You have this Morgu line, spirit born of death. Perhaps the spirit can be transformed in death with this Lord of Essence technology and augmented into these non-corporeal entities we call gods, which then have physical incarnations known as avatars. In the third episode, we will look into taking this seriously, asking if the Broken Land symbolizes anything about the gemstone-specific death mechanics with souls in the reincarnation process. There are almost no examples of an ascension concept in Shadow World. The one quasi-exception is Leia, who was an exceptional demigod. And the scientist father of Kadaena's daughter wanted to invent a way to make themselves into gods, which is an obscure detail buried in the Burning Night book, but who knows. Something else that is weird about this, though, is that this idea of Orgiana waiting for revenge only makes sense after the purge of her servant gods during the Wars of Dominion, which happened when the Lords of Orhan got mad at them and intervened. In the late 1990 context, this should have been late in the wars. This poem is referring to conditions that did not exist yet in the time of Uthex, much less in deep antiquity when ancient Iruaric was spoken, and the Broken Lands was sealed off after Uthex. Depending on how you interpret modern Iruaric, the alphabetic writing could be from the Second Era. Of course, only the Morgul stanza is present, not the whole Temple of Darkness poem. But then it's speaking of an ancient relationship, and where was Morgul? Uthex was not working in this place with Morgul flying around. He had to have been subtly seduced by unlife cultists. The story also notably says it was already barren. So were these dark grotto creatures already there, dating back to the Lords of Essence? The Uthex story only speaks of the hooded figures as his perverted creations, which is intriguing for other reasons because those are almost human. If the Broken Lands is another plane of existence, it would have been abandoned for thousands of years because the Dark Gods arrived in this universe early in the Second Era. If it dates back to the First Era, that chamber was made for Morgul. But our OOC premise from Kygar is that the Dark Gods and forces of unlife work together during the Wars of Dominion. The puzzle for entering it involves speaking in Iruaric phrase, just as the graveyard had Kadaena Throck Farok, and that mechanism is listed in the source books as one type of Lord of Essence portal, but Bandur was obviously able to make one himself. The presence of the stanza in the Temple of Darkness, which is somewhere else, presumably on Kolthia, suggests both authenticity and some form of common descent through Morgul. Morgul could be speaking ancient Iruaric and others are transcribing it, but there are various anachronistic qualities about it. When was this dark shrine actually built? That alphabet writing system under the bas-relief, one would imagine, should not have existed yet in the First Era. Jasek, who we call Justev, claims to have been the one who invented many of the Kolthian alphabets. All of the humanoid races on Shadow World descend from the same race as the Lords of Essence. These were the Althans. The Lords of Essence were only a special subset of that species. So the languages of Kolthia are almost all etymologically related to Iruaric. That's at least implied by 1992 in the second edition of the Master Atlas, when the Elven language Erlin had some overlap words with Iruaric. But regardless, Kygar seems to have First Era Iruaric as hieroglyphic, and there's solid odds the alphabet versions are Second Era. Which, if that is the case, the Dark Shrine is from the Second Era, or else there was knowledge across time in the First Era. Knowledge across time sounds like an outlandish possibility to take seriously, but in the next episode you'll see why I think it's actually quite likely. You might recall I pointed out similar issues with the graveyard. It has a room with long-forgotten script on tombstones, but equally old monuments that have modern language writing on them, and other timeline issues, raising questions about whether there was some seeing the future involved, which I went over in the context of the Lords of Essence as well. Trying to parse the internal logic of the whens may be futile for the same reason I think it is in the graveyard. Because if the room painting is at all allegorical, parallel to something else or symbolic, then that use of imagery can cause unintended consistency paradoxes, which is something for the third episode. So we run the risk of being led astray, considering consistency with considerations not intended to be considered. Interestingly, the crypt in the Dark Shrine borrows the poem phrase, silent repose for the bodies, which underlines the point that repose in the poem really does imply waiting in death. And I would note that Kadaena is more meaningfully the mother of darkness, having been the creator of many monsters from her depraved experiments, though the Black Hell gods did create the Black Hell demons. Something subtle about the huge cavern, and Trachton partly caught this in 1984, is that it has running water flowing through it, which Morgul hates. Morgul actually takes damage from running water and flees rain. Trachton was the first person to enter the Dark Shrine, likely the first to assume the whole area was on Charon. He interpreted the stream as having prevented Morgul from reaching the rune portal. This is wrong, of course, because Morgul could just fly out the windows. He certainly would not have fit in those cracks in the tunnels. Amusingly, you could interpret Lixides instead as a corruption of Lixorus, which would mean dread of water. This command would be constitutive form. The multiplicity of meanings defining his properties, which is a serious possibility to be considered. That the Lords of Essence were not just giving descriptive names to their living creations, but that their methods using Iruaric fashioned physical properties through word meaning. These are just one letter to the left, Addis and Urus, on a standard QWERTY keyboard, but who knows what Kygar intended. Kygar is actually Iruaric as well. It is the Iruaric word for star, Kygar Ilstari. And actually, there was another discrepancy in his glossary. The word for secret there is Shren instead of Aren. That might just be a typo since the keyboard letters are right next to each other, but it might also be a hint for decoding Addis. But something more subtle than the stream that has probably always been overlooked are the stalagmites. The forest of stalagmites is formed from water slowly raining from the ceiling, so this is very much a place Morgul would not want to hang out now. Morgul has not been here for thousands of years, maybe even thousands of years before Uthex, though that is not clear. And if he was made as a servant of Orgiana, and this really were somewhere on the moon Charon, the reason Morgul is not there now could be that Orgiana was banished to the Black Hell. But that huge stairway was clearly built for him, even though he has wings. And all of that must have been carved out using the Magru, which is described as an astonishing engineering feat, a marvel. There's no apparent reason for Morgul to even go down there, but I will explain that in the third episode. Another subtle point, maybe even more subtle than the stalagmites, is the boiling sea of mud. That is throwing off a lot of fog. That has to be what is forming the snow, which has to be what is melting and running into the huge cavern. Morgul would not want to be anywhere near a humid and foggy location. Humidity, of course, helps with the growth of the fungus. Magru obviously resembles Morgul, but I do not know the motivation for it. It could just as easily play off the Gru monsters, human bat hybrids originally, predators in the darkness from computer games back into the late 70s. Wandering around blindly in the dark without a light source was inviting death. It is pitch black. You are likely to be eaten by a Gru, which is very on the nose for the Magru tunnels. Before moving on to the next major issue, I want to look more at this Temple of Darkness poem. There's nothing established about the Temple of Darkness, not where it is, not when it was destroyed. It is in ruins, so it is most likely ruined after the Wars of Dominion, and this refers to the Charon pantheon deities, though not the other Black Hell gods, nor the Dancers of Enos, the Dark Spirit Servants of Enos. There are other Charon spirits and gods, but they were first defined in later books, and as I have said, the Dark Lords of Charon are not really a pantheon. It is unclear if this might, say, really be a Temple of Orgiana, hence the Temple of Darkness, or if it were more specifically her Temple of Burning Night. There was also a Temple of Night that fell to a Loremaster raid in 450 Third Era, a few centuries after the Wars of Dominion, where a Loremaster speaking Iruaric absolved the soul of an evil high priest, Nirdru, after the demonic servants guarding him had all been destroyed, the unlife shrieking through him from beyond the wall of darkness, burning through Nirdru, showing he was a hollow shell, which I mentioned in my Graveyard series for how Bandur looks when he's under good lighting. There's a fairly obvious parallel between the Nirdru and Uthex stories. The Nirdru story was included in the Tombs of Colthea. It was a vignette in the 1989 Master Atlas. But the bottom line also says the Temple of Darkness poem was translated, which makes you wonder if it was written in Iruaric there as well. I would say that Enos, Keshtakai, Andras, Zatar, Scalu, Morales, Clysis, and Xania are played straight. That stuff is all consistent with what is given for them in the source books. I've already dissected how Orgiana and Morgul are off canon. Omir, who we call Onar, is called Dark Assassin, Patient Vengeance, Righteous Retribution. This is unusual. Omir is coolly professional and rarely kills without a reason. He is sent by the Dark Lords to kill off people they find especially troublesome. Dark spirits have a lot more flexibility than dark gods for visiting Colthea. In the Ice version, he is not linked specifically with Orgiana, but here in the Temple of Darkness poem, it's talking about vengeance and righteous retribution. That's out of character for Omir, who is explicitly emotionless. It fits instead for the Dark Lords he is serving. The vengeance theme stands out just as it did for the Orgiana stanza. Zatar has vengeful warrior, but his canon description talks about swinging his weapon with a vengeance. So this is more hinting that the poem refers to the conditions after the Wars of Dominion ended, when the Dark Lords had been defeated and imprisoned, so they would want retribution, which, it was an inscription found in the temple ruins. They probably inscribed this stuff before the temple fell. Might still be a little weird for it to be there, unless it's a case like the Temple of Night. The Xenia description could similarly be interpreted as dating it, but that is ambiguous because the moon orbits in cycles. We call her Zelia now. She was originally a dark spirit. The pantheon of neutrality was not until late 1990s Atlantia. Scalu was a nightmare god, not an insanity god. Xenia was the insanity goddess serving the Dark Lords. Then you have Akhenaten, who we call Amasalan, who is explicitly a servant of Chlysis. In Atlantia, his true master is supposed to be disputed. In practice, it always gets treated as Lukos. But the way Akhenaten is described here comes across as severely different from his temperament. Akhenaten, Dark Watcher, Grim Reaper, gathering the tares. That's treating Akhenaten as some kind of psychopomp of souls for the Dark Lords of Charon. He's not like a Grim Reaper at all in the source books. His thing is bloodlust and bloody sacrifices. Gathering the tares is a biblical allusion about taking only the worthy souls. You are also not supposed to gather the tares before Judgment Day, because you will be reaping the good and the bad together. Tares being essentially weeds that resemble the wheat before harvest time. So the tares could be interpreted as servants of the unlife. So it could be a hint that the Broken Lands is doing something off-canon with the death concepts in Gemstone, which is something I'll get into in the third episode. The only sense Dark Watcher can make is that he visits to oversee ritual sacrifices. I may be being too anal on this one, put off by Grim, because he is energized by frenzied religious celebrations, but he's there to watch ritual sacrifices, where his master is a soul taker who eats souls, and these sacrifices, it was probably mostly the Chlysis theocracy, are bad guys, tares. So it might not be as off-canon as I'm making it out. I will say that Akhenaten does have a psychopomp role in the Lankan Empire, the theocracy of Chlysis and Emer, in the later source books. Xenia was also ascended from a mortal in that treatment. Well, as a religious belief, probably not in actuality, but very rare example of the ascension concept. In those later books, the souls of the followers of the Dark Gods do go to Charon, where they are reincarnated or sent through the portals to the Pales. But that was never explicitly stated in early enough books, which brings us to our next issue. What about this old idea that the Broken Land is really the moon of the Dark Gods? That interpretation goes all the way back to 1994. You can see it in Tracton's article about the Dark Grotto and Shrine. Ishara told me that Kali once said there was a Zatar training ground up there. I have no idea. I have no records of such things from, say, 1995. I know there was some Hrask versus Charon role play, for example, but I know very little about what was involved with it. But the presence of a Morgu shrine is hardly proof. There's other stuff, like the meteor strikes. People think of moons as hit by meteors, or that you push what is now the Lornon button to access the jagged plane. But again, that only suggests Uthex was aware of the Morgu shrine, that it was associated with the Dark Lords of Charon. Why would he be working in the home of the Dark Gods during the Wars of Dominion? You could argue they were away from home, rampaging and conquering, but that is very dubious. They have to go back to the moon every so many hours, even when they have portals. It would make more sense for this to be some as-then abandoned older realm, because the Dark Gods came to this universe in 1900 Second Era. Post-Ice Age is a whole other ballgame. It was called the Moon in the news blurb for the Cleric Self-Resurrection spell release event. Something much more subtle is that the Shruvian Monastery, released in 1997, has various highly rare alloys in it. Black Aura, Veil Iron, Valen, Credera. Now, the materials document we have now was not until 2001, so that materials lore did not hold in 1997. The most recent metals documentation at that time was what had been true in Shadow World. Those happened to be the 4 rarest alloys in that world setting. Vanum, which is now Valen, was a Slayer metal only known to exist on Charon, and there's Valen all over the Shruvian monastery, on Drazir. That's a pretty clear indication it was meant to be Lornon. In the Atlantia world setting, it is the gods who once dwelled on Lornon. The Arcadi do not still reside on the moons, whereas in Shadow World, the anchor points of power for the deities are on their respective moons. They only have limited duration abilities for coming down to the world physically. It's not a problem for the Lornon context, but it is for the Charon context. But then maybe Dark God stuff happened there in 1995 I don't know about. So, back to its original context, its ice context. For it to be the moon, the backstory for the place has to be wrong, unreliable narration, or outright lying. The document has 2 separate parts. One is a tale talking about the raid on Uthex. The other part is some scholarly overview of what is known from records. It says from the records of the Montep Unterken. That might well refer to the tale rather than the analysis under it, sort of like was done with the History of Fashionable document from 2008. But is the analysis OOC documentation, or is it I.C.E. analysis by a scribe of Namikos? I'm not sure. If it is within world analysis, it could be factually unreliable. It says natural gateway to another plane of existence, and that could be based on willfully corrupted records, hiding something dangerous like Lord of Essence portal to the evil moon Charon. Lord of Essence portals are sometimes hidden underground. The blackness and dizziness of the portal would have come from the same documentation which notes that fact. It's really suspect having a natural portal that just happens to come out right next to this stuff. And the premise of records of its location having been lost or destroyed is stated explicitly. So we instead have to ask, is this place consistent with Charon? If you're looking at the 1989 documentation for Charon, the Charon entry in the tombs of Colthea, it sounds almost plausible. Surface is frozen with ice. There are tunnels and caverns underground with unspeakable monsters in them. There's volcanic heating, presumably from tidal forces for the interior. But the Charon gods did not exist in 1989. If you look at the 1990 description of Charon, it is deeply inconsistent with the Broken Lands. There is no atmosphere. There is almost no gravity even at the surface. There wouldn't have been anyway, but it is explicitly stated. The surface is covered in hundreds of feet of ice. In 1992, it's actually dry ice, not water. But I have to play devil's advocate here, speaking up for the Loremasters lie theory about it being another dimension. What if it is not the surface of Charon? What if the whole area is underground? That's crazy, you might say. There's a whole mountain range. It would have to stretch beyond the horizon, because you never see the enclosure. Fine. But look at what the McGrew presumably did with the huge cavern in that colossal stairway. It might well be that the mountains themselves were artificially created underground. That one sheer cliff looks artificial, like it was cut with a huge knife. That's a big concept, right? That would be staggering. But what about the meteors, you might ask? Who's to say those falling rocks are meteors? What happens when a meteor swarm is cast indoors? Pieces of the ceiling come crashing down on you instead of the meteors. There's way more rock on the jagged plane than a meteor swarm cast justifies. It might be a partial collapse of the cavern roof or enclosure. The broken land as literally the broken land. Yes, but I can cast my outdoor spells. But that is not so clear. Call Lightning, for example, didn't work on the jagged plane back in 1994. That may well be an example of changes to mechanics that have obscured something meaningful. This is like the non-teleportable rooms in the graveyard that no longer work, or the creature roaming mechanics now obscuring older symbolic placement. The looking at the sky mechanic did not exist until 2002, so that approach is out. What about the light source if the sun is blocked by the cavern roof? Maybe there's phosphorescent vapor obscuring the distant ceiling, or persistent phosphorescence in high-up crystals, in which case it might be getting irradiated and charged up by the crystal dome. The Micklean frequency by their color spectrum may be hinting at it. What about the gravity in the atmosphere? Well, there may well be atmosphere and barely livable conditions deep underground, where it is warmer because of volcanic forces. There's an ecosystem down there with glowing fungus and so on and so on. The snow on the mountains can come from the condensation of the fog. If it is enclosed, the air does not escape. And the gravity? Well, if it's an enclosed space, remember, the Lords of Essence were an extremely technologically advanced race. That whole area might have an artificial gravity field. When you look at the technology chart for Shadow World, that level of terraforming was well within their ability. So we cannot dismiss out of hand that this is underground below the surface of Charon. Surface stone wouldn't work for the volcanism, and it's less plausible for artificial mountains. Charon was most likely just a large asteroid captured by gravity. You would need to go deeper to carve out artificial mountains. Otherwise, you would need to fabricate lots of rock upwards. And the source material said if you went down there, you would be in a bizarre alien world. The falling rocks would be more of a problem for a surface dome because there cannot be a hole in the roof. Otherwise, the atmosphere would evacuate out into space, unless there was a force field. But if there was a force field, rocks would not be coming down. Deep underground, in a volcanically active place, an occasional falling rock is fine. Now, you might say, what about these hypothetically extraplanar creatures in the tunnels and caverns? Well, that could be consistent with either case because Charon's tunnels have demons. Charon was a gate world having unspeakable monsters even in the 1989 version, though there are seemingly no demons in the Broken Land. I will say that the 1990 book has an intriguing typo on this point. It mislabels the section to check for that. It meant part 3 and 4 for demons, not parts 4 and 5. You go looking at part 5 for creatures existing under Charon, and you find Kadaena's artificial constructs, such as the Gogor, Arv rule. So who knows, maybe that typo was a point of inspiration. But there's only a very weak case for Charon, unless you assume it is underground and also very artificial. Something far more obscure, which I do not think was intentional, was that there was a book called The Curse of Cabus from 1995. That is, its copyright date is 1995, the earliest I'm aware of, which should be too late. But in that book, which is considered not canon by Shadow World aficionados, Empress Kadaena had a workshop on the moon Charon. And what she was doing there was the last straw that set off the Lords of Essence Civil War. She created an artificial demiplane that was sort of coexistent with the moon Charon, a spherical space lined with massive volumes of rock material gutted from the interior of Charon, and over the millennia extraplanar entities wandered their way into it. It is sealed off from the rest of Charon, so the Dark Lords have no access to it. That could be weirdly compelling for the Broken Land, but I do not think it existed early enough, and there are inconsistencies anyway. What we'll end up doing in the third episode is taking the other planes of existence thing as the default assumption. You have this 1990 timeline entry about powerful crystals being used to create the portals, that there were portals on Charon leading to parallel dimensions. This is interesting wording because there are parallel material worlds that are very difficult to reach in the Shadow World cosmology. Then we can also notice that the dimensions in the unlife direction are sometimes called negative universes. So one possibility I will float in the next episode is interpreting it as an upside-down parallel dimension of the Sealfar Strake. Because we know the Sealfar Strake through the Broken Land was designed as a unified concept. I think this is plausible because it was done more blatantly in Shadow Valley. Let's take a look at some other inconsistencies. When you look around the Lycerian Hills, you see reference to the Trollfang Mountains. This is a de-ice anomaly. Khald's Fang became Trollfang, Dragon's Fang became Dragon's Claw. In Atlanthia, the mountains just became known as the Dragon's Claw Mountains. Honestly, it's dubious to call the mountains in the Sealfar Strake Khald's Fang or Dragon's Fang. That should probably be reserved for the southern mountain range, which is part of the Soral March. Sealfar Strake is the Black Fork mountain range, geologically speaking at least. Culturally, you can go either way with it. That's me being anal with the terminology, but it's slightly relevant, the exact location, what Khadgar was treating as the southern end of the Sealfar Strait. Because if it's further south in that peninsula, west of the high plateau, the windward edge of the high plateau, it'd be smack inside the territory of Bandur Etrevion's theocracy. I think it is very highly likely that the hooded figures were Dark Path cultists, which was a regional theocracy in homage of Empress Kadaena, which puts the Broken Land right in their wheelhouse. Matching interests. Swipe right. Khadgar did not become a GM until Christmas time in 1991, and the graveyard stuff had already been made previously. So for there to be parallels or connections to graveyard design concepts would require GM communication. But I've been bringing up a lot of the same stuff as in the Graveyard series, and it's happening for a completely independent set of reasons. That could reflect my bias, making all the ships sail the same way, or it might really be there. When we do the third episode, I will make this Graveyard and Broken Lands link stronger, because they both firmly fit my theory of the subtext and the death mechanics. Suppose that was not the intent. Who would these subtle forces of the unlife have been? Well, if the Broken Lands were really Charon, it would have servants of the unlife. Though frankly in 1990 that should be interpreted as meaning the Dark Gods. There's also no mention of the Dark Gods having followers with them up there in 1990. How Uthex would have found his way there in the first place if the forces of the unlife that influenced him were residing on Charon would be a mystery. The other theory can explain that, and it can be both. But remember, the portals were guarded by the Lords of Orhan after the wars. The Dark Gods were more or less imprisoned by them on Charon. So they should be there now in the Third Era, and they should want to use that portal. With that caveat that Orgiana and perhaps Morgu, if her servant, were banished. Remember, Scalu wanted to come here through a portal in the Estrion event. The Lords of Orhan also set up enchanted immortal guardians at the portals at the end of the Wars of Dominion. There's nothing like that for the gateway on either side of the Misty Chamber. Something else I would note is this exact year 6521 Second Era. This may be an arbitrary date chosen to be in the early years, consistent with the Bandur Etrevion story, but there are very few specific events defined for the Wars of Dominion. And if you notice in the one timeline I showed from a later book, 6521 is the exact year Lorgalis conquered Seralis with an Ordainer. Northern Seralis, by comparative geography with Atlantia, would be Vernavis through Talador. In fact, since Kelborn did not exist in the Second Era, this area may have been considered Seralis in the Second Era. Frustratingly, I cannot find this in a source book earlier than 1998. Bizarre coincidence, perhaps. But for all I know, there was some other released material at an earlier date which already had that detail in its history of events. That's frustrating because, as I said in the Graveyard series, by world logic consistency, Lorgalis ought to have been the warlord Kestrel was serving. Lorgalis' father was also a Lord of Essence from the First Era. In the 1989 books, Lorgalis himself was from the First Era. It doesn't hugely matter, but it could relate to why the Loremasters went there to do an intervention on Uthex. Lorgalis was their main enemy in the 1989 books. He had a vendetta against Andrax. At one point, I considered that door mechanism to keep people out was protecting from people like Lorgalis. After all, they made it difficult to reach the portal, but it's not as difficult to leave the monastery. There was a theocracy of Kadaena right around there, as we've addressed, but Khadgar said it is an unlife invasion theme. The idea is to watch the gate so evil forces don't come through it. What level of force could those monks repel, though? What volume of bad guys are on the other side? It's always seemed more intuitive to me that the idea would be to keep people in this world away from it. I have to think the Loremasters built the door mechanisms for the hidden monastery. The Loremasters easily gained access to Uthex's workshop, supposedly. The monastery that was founded were monks venerating Orhan, and there's some indication it was emphasis on K. Monks were not a profession class in Gemstone back then, but in I.C.E. they were mostly unarmed combat. Semi-arms Essence Realm in Rolemaster, semi-arms Mentalism in Shadow World. Bards are also swapped. Mentalism and Rolemaster, Essence and Shadow World. So-called Amthorian monks and bards after Terry Amthor, the principal author of Shadow World, who unfortunately passed away a couple of months ago. He was only 62. But K in Shadow World will use a spear in battle, but what he's really master of is unarmed combat. It isn't clear to me that these monks are based on anything more specific. They shouldn't be Shangramai, who do more of a paid mercenary thing. If it was a big enough deal, they could be Zeosian, the warrior monks who serve the Titans of Emer, demigod offspring of the Lords of Oran. The Titans, I mean, not the monks. But there really isn't a strong case for anything I've come across. Kagar did say they struggled there for centuries, so they have to be a very long-lived race, most likely elves, with an outside chance of hymen. Monastic liches are very rare in Rolemaster. Most liches are evil mages, evil clerics, sorcerers, the usual suspects. But monastic liches are monks. Monks who come across text they should not be reading. Interestingly, their creature description is more consistent with the liches. That is, liches as described in 1995 in Creatures and Monsters, which is important because anything that suggests something was tampered with later has to be red flagged. The creatures in GemStone have fine but tattered robes and glowing red eyes, which is consistent with the 1995 and onwards lich description, but not consistent with the earlier lich description. Liches are made with a ritual of twilight, which takes a year and a day. If unsuccessful, the soul is blasted to pieces. Then it specifies that classical liches are made with an older and even more dangerous ritual. This defines the ritual of Black Eternity, a level 30 evil cleric spell, as removing their organs into a special container. This is essentially a phylactery, except in Rolemaster it's holding their organs. They cannot be permanently destroyed unless this jar is destroyed. When you look at the creature in GemStone, it has a gaping hole in its chest, and they have an ambient where they reach into the hole, or at least they do when they are damaged or near death. They slowly regenerate hit points, at least at very low HP. You can keep hitting them with Arcane Blast without killing them if you space the hits out long enough. In the third episode, I will conjecture a different interpretation of the hole in the chest. I think it would be a reasonable guess that these spectral monks came from monks who were unsuccessful at becoming monastic liches. That might not have been the intent. It might have just been, this is a thematically consistent thing to have here. Spectral monks are not from the Rolemaster bestiaries, but the monastic liches were probably tampered with later, and we have to be cautious about assuming they comport with 1992 original intent. The giant fog beetles I know had their messaging tampered with when they were put on the BCS system. The Keelan do not have the creature description for Keelan from the bestiaries. They actually have the Kirin description, which is interesting, because that's the mythologically correct visual of them. Their Keelan is a malevolent ice and sea-themed creature with a body of a greyhound and a head of a stag. It would pretend to be a unicorn to impale virgins with its horn. Their burning horn might have come from this version. The description on the Play.net website with the ox's tail and dragon head and so on is for the benevolent flying Kirin. When you have a Keelan spawned in the game, it doesn't actually give you a creature description for them. So I'm talking about the one on the Play.net website. Maybe they used to have it. Keelan, by the way, are more dangerous than they look. They cast at you with your own casting strength. Worm sent a big multi-horned Keelan at us a couple of months ago. It was mad we were hunting its kind for sport. He had it speaking astrally to us. Keelan are extraplanar now, mechanically. They're not in Rolemaster, they're just chimeras. On the subject of things getting tampered with, and after all, there was a whole de-ice, and however many game mechanics to combat since then. Recall that the hooded figure area is a clone, that there's an older copy of it on segment 306. My gut is that the bas relief with the panel where you type Uthex is an original puzzle. But because it was a game puzzle, there's no information recorded for it. The same goes for the puzzle on the other side with the stalactite. Stormfront screws up the kerning, but you can copy and paste it. The bas-relief depicts 3 moons on a starry night. Vintage ASCII art. It was more of a thing back then. The moons on the relief now say Liabo, Lornon, and Makiri, so they should have been Orhan, Charon, and Makori. I mentioned that Makori in Shadow World does not orbit Orhan, only Tlaloc does. The description on the small moon on the relief, interestingly, only commits to it probably being Makori. If Tlaloc was represented on the artwork, it would have to say 4 moons on a starry night. At a glance, this looks about right. Large moon is Orhan, medium moon is Charon, small moon is Makori. But if you're being really anal, these parentheses on the big moon would have to be craters. That isn't consistent with the Orhan lore. Its surface is heavily obscured by clouds, with oceans, rivers, forests, waterfalls, farms, and garden landscapes. Again, it says 3 moons, not 4 moons or 5 moons. If you are being extremely anal, the relative scaling is way off for that being Orhan as well. So, long shot conspiracy theory with very thin evidence. The one that says Liabo now, maybe that said Varan originally, and that got edited to Liabo manually. There used to be 5 moons. The second largest was Varan. It was only about twice as large as Charon. Closer than Charon, too, making it bigger in the sky. And Varan doesn't have a de-ice replacement term. So if it was Varan, it would have been retconned. On the other hand, in the Allura Shrine, the celestial alignment of Orhan and Charon has Charon coming out from behind Orhan. This is not consistent with the canon moon lore, unless Charon has an extremely elliptical orbit. Maybe it's a rare alignment where, say, Charon is farthest out and Orhan is closest, when Orhan just happens to be synced with that on its polar orbit. But in canon, Charon is closer than Orhan, even at its apogee. Orhan would have to get closer than the book suggests. So, me being difficult about the moon lore is about something more serious, whether the canon for Charon applies to the Broken Lands. Allura's Shrine was not, I think, part of the original design concept for the Sealfar Strake. That was something Kygar and Fond worked on together. It was where the climax took place for the first storyline with Marlise, the girl who shapeshifts into a puma, or maybe the other way around. That's very Central American folklore, as I said. Nawals, shamans shapeshifting into pumas. Allura has a lot of shrines just like this in Shadow World canon. It is in the Master Atlas Addendum from 1990. There's also an image of one in the Emer book from 1990. I haven't seen it in any of the later books. It's not in the 1992 Master Atlas. Another data point for Kygar used the book from 1990. The basic idea of the Allura shrines is that they are rural and earthen in construction. They all have a symbol with 3 leaves on a branch. Most gods in Shadow World do not have defined symbols. This is called the Flower of Amara now in GemStone Shrine. Those leaves in Gemstone were filled with tear crystals. The lunar alignment shined light through them. That lunar alignment stuff isn't part of the Shadow World source material for it. There is an altar with special organic smoke stones embedded into it. You soak the stone with special herbs, and there's an herb garden in the Amara Shrine, but here it says bloodstone. And the Allura follower sleeps in the shrine with the burned incense. Then Allura might give them a dream vision as they sleep. Smoking hallucinogens in Gemstone, folks. Supposedly, narwhals, one's spirit animal, essentially, guardian spirits, are learned by going to an isolated spot and having a dream vision of them. At least according to Encyclopedia Britannica. Who knows if that's a coincidence or not. My understanding is that Fawn did a lot of RP as Lords of Orhan, including Allura with this shrine. The person to ask about that would be Eric. He talked to Allura a lot in that shrine. The last thing I will bring up about things that may be different from the original intent is in the monastery around that top level meditation room. If you look at Wilder's map in the 1992 Calfor edition, there is a whole ring of the monastery that is missing now. It is conceivable that it was erroneously drawn since that's the shape of the bottom level rooms. But when you consider the care that went into all the details of the sewers, it seems hard to believe a mistake that large would have been made. So there may have been several rooms directly above the abbot level rooms on the west end originally, And that can make sense because, as I noted in the first episode, the dining hall has 14 seats, but there are only 13 beds. And these are ascetic monks after all. There probably wasn't someone shacking up with the abbot with his nice four-poster bed. There may have been a 14th bedroom in this missing wing. Or maybe they had a servant of the unlight visiting them, slowly corrupting them with dark knowledge. Something else in the gallery room with the artwork and craftsmanship, which seems mostly aesthetic. The monastery has a couple of instances of rare black modware, which would have said windak. Technically, windak is just the seal tang word for pine trees, but there's nothing about rare black windak in the books. Part of me wonders if it should really be deer. The painting, as I said, says Undead Wars, but that was probably replacing Wars of Dominion. The bust says it is a famous face you've seen before but cannot remember. If we take that seriously in the Shadow World context, that would have to be a famous person in the Second Era. That's something of a tall order, being famous enough in the Second Era that you are recognized 6,000 years later. Andrax is that famous. There's a statue of him outside the Library of Namikos. But he might be too famous in a way to not be recognized. Charon Avenue used to be Andrax Avenue after all. So it could be one of the other founding Loremasters, or it could be the founder of the Shangrumai Monastery. That kind of thing. In later books, that was Tanris Dictarian, who was actually a Loremaster. His grandson Tavar is the head of defenses at Carillon. Actually, Tavar Dictarian's niece, Rowena, was the NPC at the auction with that Black Hell Slayer demon scimitar. But this bust is an annoying tease. We have no way of knowing who it really is. The depiction of the Great Moon is ice. That's an ice term for Orhan, now Liabo. That's one of those ice things that slipped back into the modern documentation because it was still called the Great Moon in a few places in-game. The other stuff I can't really make any sense of in the Shadow World context. And then over in Uthex's abode, there is a globe of the world in the looted library with the continents represented on it. I do not know if this has been tampered with, if it might have once had more information on it. That part of the map, remember, is a disjointed replacement. It's on segment 487 instead of 306. If the globe had some excessively specific details like some unconverted ice continent names, it is conceivable something like that would just get rewritten entirely. Regardless, the globe gives no indication either way of a major point of Kolthea's world geography. After the First Era, the western and eastern hemispheres were divided by the Eyes of Utha. These are two gemstones at the North and South Pole, extremely powerful artifacts. They form an immensely powerful essence barrier called the Wall of Darkness. The Wall of Darkness is not just a force field, it is blocking out the negative universe of the unlife, which is what explains why the Wall of Darkness is invoked that way in the Nirdru story. So, globes of Kolthea, Shadow World in the Second and Third Eras are incomplete. They leave the Eastern Hemisphere blank, lacking information for it. You see it in the Library of Namikos, you see it on Nexus, the home isle of the Navigators. The Eastern Hemisphere is blank. But if the globe was from the First Era, the time of the Wars of Essence, it would have been both hemispheres illustrated. Likewise, the moon Charon passes over the Eastern Hemisphere due to its orbital cycle. So if the broken land were actually on Charon, and you were able to look at the sky, you would be able to make a globe with the eastern continent shown on it. What we have written for this globe does not say one way or the other. The continents might well look different on the First Era globe because of how cataclysmic that war was on the world. The question really is if it used to say something more meaningful. Maybe it's the original wording. If it was, this bit about being unable to spin from rust is winkingly evading the issue I'm raising. I'm just flagging it because what the globe actually looks like can have major implications. One last thing I wanted to look at is anything in Rolemaster related to the making of artificial constructs. The methods that Kadaena used to make these things are never specified. You have odd hints, like shards get called demons, and in the bestiaries they're made out of men or elves. Rolemaster published a construct companion in 2003 which synthesizes a lot of this stuff. Shards are explicitly made using demon blood and other ingredients in the construct companion. Gagor would arguably be classified as advanced simulacra as well, which are artificial beings grown in special containers. The blood of the creator is typically used, and creature properties are modified that same kind of way. The Kiska rocks and giant fog beetles would more likely be abominations, subsets of the changeling category where a living thing is mutated. Abominations are unnatural unions across species boundaries. You can do things like make them grow bone projections, reminiscent of the bony protrusions on Mictlantecuhtli, or increase the strength of scales, or so on. Obviously, the Construct Companion was made too late to be relevant, but it could incorporate older stuff I haven't come across yet. One thing that is old enough is Rolemaster's Alchemy Companion from 1992, which describes a lot of the metals and so on. There is an evil alchemist profession in that which could be relevant to Uthex. Kygar's laboratory in the interview had various alchemist tools, including an athanor, a furnace used by alchemists. So it's not implausible that he looked through the Alchemist Companion at some point. It was normal for GMs back then to be given whole sets of ice books. This is interesting because the evil alchemist spell list concerned with magic artifacts and such involves some anti-magical kind of stuff. They have a discharge list that suppresses magic from objects in a radius and even drains power or spells into the evil alchemist. They have an unmaking list that suppresses magic of given realms from items. The Califor edition in 1992 said people claim the power-sucking dome drains their magic items. Evil alchemists also trap and store spirits and embed demons into objects. They also have some mastery over poisons. So I'm mentioning this because of the kinds of spell realm-specific immunities or near immunities that the Broken Lands creatures have, and some have power draining or energy backlash, which are properties that do not come from the Rolemaster or Shadow World creatures I've identified for them. There may be a little bit more to be found out there that's relevant to Uthex's methods, but there's also no guarantee that any such book was actually used. That's enough for this episode. There is a lot of stuff here, and I do not have it fully disentangled. I might well be dancing around the actual intent. My gut is it is roughly that you have the dark gods originating in Kadaena, that Kadaena may herself have become a dark god, and you have this theocracy of Kadaena, which only exists in GemStone, which is serving the Unlife. So you have the Unlife and Dark Lords working together in the Wars of Dominion, that they have shared roots in the evil faction of the Lords of Essence, that the Broken Lands is showing how the Dark Gods came from the Lords of Essence serving the Unlife, rather than showing, say, the Dark Path theocracy working with Morgul in the Second Era, that they were using Uthex to help unlock how to use ancient Essence Lord artifacts, and that the Dark Shrine itself probably dates back to the First Era. So there's some knowledge across time happening because of the temporal paradoxes in it. But yet another way of resolving those paradoxes would be to argue that Lord of Essence portals are capable of time travel, which means the Broken Land could be in the future, where Uthex had ancient ruins that had not been built yet. Now that would really jumble things up. The Dark Gods may more simply themselves be the surviving followers of Kadaena who fashioned the first of the great demons, which would make them ancient speakers of Iruaric, as well as dead spirits transformed into extraplanar beings, spirits born of death, so to speak, consistent with Kadaena in episode 5 of my Graveyard series. The Dark Lords are the same kind of entity as the Lords of Orhan, just from the more chaotic part of the Essence spectrum. If you recall from the third episode of my Graveyard series, I talked about how the Dark Lords were related to the demons of the Pale, that great demons are sometimes described as fallen demigods, so fashioning both demons and dark gods follows logically. The most powerful Black Hell demons, Invokers, remarkably, were thought to be demigodal offspring of the Black Hell gods, but this is assuming any of those parts of the source material were treated as relevant. By posing what about questions that are scrubbing it too hard, I might be overcomplicating it by pulling in too much context. That is a deep uncertainty, an unknown unknown, not knowing how much of the source material matters. There's also the question of whether the backstory has elements in it that are meant to be wrong. That is, unreliable narration based on flawed records, falsified to keep people away. Which is, you're telling a story, so you don't just jump to the end with a big reveal. It's actually Charon. Snape kills Dumbledore. Soylent and McGrew are made of people. In the next episode, I will get into the allegory, which is about the death mechanics, and it strengthens the argument for both positions, interpreting it as underground below the surface of Charon, and interpreting it as some other plane of existence. I will even float the possibility that it is both, Charon as it exists in a parallel dimension. After all, even in canon, Charon is indeed a gate world which hovers on the boundary between dimensions. Thank you for watching my deep colonoscopy of the Broken Land. Hopefully you've learned something worth knowing, because it will drive you mad and make you into a slave of the unlife. Hey guys, if you want to see more of my fantabulous videos, be sure to click one of these links. But I warn you, it will put you at serious risk of becoming a huge nerd. Better train in that atomic wedgie C-man to brace yourselves. I mean, I'm assuming. Like I can be bothered to learn anything about the PSM review. Don't be a square.